I had the opportunity to see the preview a couple months ago that was just as moving. And I have to say that your song Process is now added to my top 5 songs of my whole life. So it's so beautiful, so thank you. Also wanted to introduce Yoki Bratt. Please join us. Yoki is a board-certified music therapist and professor and program director of the PhD in Creative Arts Therapies program at Drexel University. Thank you. You can read more about her bio on our website. Next, Dr. Kevin Louie. Leo? Did I say? Lou? Okay, Dr. Lou. Kevin is an integrative medicine physician and licensed acupuncturist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. His research focuses on integrative therapies for cancer symptoms. Thank you, Kevin. And my good friend Peter Giannata, Dr. Peter Giannata. Is a professor and neuroscientist in the UC Davis Department of Psychology and is a faculty member at the UC Davis's Center for Mind and Brain. I wanted to welcome the panel, but I would be remiss if I didn't want to first start with reflections on Samora's performance. And we wanted this to be spontaneous, so whoever would like to take the mic first. One more?
Do we have one more?
Okay, we can share.
We can share. Yeah. I think we are at capacity for mics.
Thoughts, reflections, reactions to Samora's work?
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's just a remarkable journey. I find myself, both in terms of the words and the music and the combination, and I mean, it's moving, and I think that's such a part of it, probably as the songwriter, composer, expressing that journey, and then I really felt a journey there too. So.
Yeah, I had a reaction first to the Process song because as you hear us, we'll talk a lot about emotions and what music can do and what that means for mental health. And I thought the Process song would be just, with your permission, be such a great song to use clinically as well with some, because I think it's a song that is just so ready for clients, I mean, for people to be able to project some of their life world onto it. And you say a lot, but you also say little. And so it allows for that room and that space to be there for people to project. And that's what we music therapists love to do, love using songs like that allow that space for projection, so that you say, was it now in Process or in Grief? Can't name the demons. Was it in Process or in Grief? Yes. Process. Sorry, I'm already getting them confused. No, but so that's true for a lot of people we work with, that they can't name what's going on with them. And so sometimes these songs allow them to just project. And then in terms of the complexity of the music with Grief, I felt in a way such a contradiction, right? Because grief can really pull you down and feel you weighted and slow down and depressed. But yet the music was at times, especially in the verses, so busy. And it's like all the running thoughts. I mean, that's what I was hearing. Like when you're grieving, there's all these thoughts that are going and it's making you crazy. Yet at the same time, you feel so heavy, full with grief. So beautiful.
Yeah, I echo Yoga and Peter. It's a very beautiful portrayal, and I would love not just clinically to use. I feel like it should have a role in medical education, right? Because like when medical training, you learn about bereavement, you learn about those classic 5 stages of grief, and it when you look at these textbook definitions, they make it seem so linear. Right, but like the song, it just does such a good job capturing how messy and like nonlinear it is, right? You kept going back to that chorus. I guess it's a process, right? And I feel like for the future people in the medical profession, like we should be required to listen to these more raw expressions, because you can't really help someone going through grieving unless you really understand how they experience it, right? Not through that textbook definition. So, no, just thank you for sharing that with us.
And Samora, it might be a great time to talk a little bit more about the Healing Project and what you did during your 8 years of interviews and the folks that you talked to, and a little bit about how you got to the compositions that you did.
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. It's very kind of all of you. And that would be amazing if it could be used in all the ways. So please do use it. All the songs, by the way, are they can be found in all places that you find music. So just take them and use them for literally whatever purpose you have. I would be very honored. And I do feel like that is like my highest goal for the work, is that it is to be used. Like I think about that a lot because I really believe that deeply in art, and not just music, but obviously particularly in music, that it has these very like esoteric things, these things you can't name about why it works, but also has very practical uses sometimes that's just like, okay, I'm going to it for this. And I really want, that's my dream for my work, is for it to be used in that way. So that's just an aside, but I appreciate that. And I'm grateful for that opportunity. As far as the Healing Project, yeah, I basically started the project as a way to engage with this question of what are all the different sites of structural violence where people are moving through it and they're never given a chance to actually talk about what it feels like to be inside of them, because they're always pathologized. So, obviously the greatest example of that is the prison industrial complex, which is a big focus of the project. And so we did talk, I did talk to many folks who I'm very close with that are either currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated about that experience. But in addition, I talked to many young people who had never been system involved, but who were dealing with, even interpersonal violence, or what people would call street violence, which I think is structural violence. And actually learned that from my dad, who teaches at UCSF, doing behavioral health. So that's actually how I got into that. But I also, talked to folks about the effects of being unhoused, about the effects of, different poverty realities, about all these different things. And, I wasn't interested in the spectacular details of what happened so much as what was the result. And then also, how are they wading through all of that complexity and trying to create the most human portrait of that. So it started with 5 years of doing interviews in 15 different states around the country, hundreds and hundreds of interviews. And then we took that whole process, myself and about 50 different collaborators, musicians, filmmakers, artists, and created all these different pieces that are basically like a constellation of works around the healing process from structural violence, and just, spun it out to as many different processes and works as we could. And that's kind of what it ended up being. And the album was the last part of that. And that was kind of my opportunity to be a little bit more personal with it. So the songs are like the most personal that I get. So everything that's in the songs I've been through as well.
Yeah, and I'll encourage folks to check out the website, because there's some new virtual experiences and interviews that were shared that were really profound. So I'll turn this over to the panel then. I wondered why you think that music is a particularly potent stimulus for the emotions, and from your various perspectives of a physician, music therapist, neuroscientist, composer, I don't know, and what are the implications for clinical practice also?
Oh, I don't know that. I'm certainly not the expert. I was recently teaching a cognitive neuroscience class, and we got to the section on emotion, and it turns out emotion is really complicated, and that there isn't really widespread agreement even on how to model it. So on the one hand, you have, sort of the basic two-dimensional model of valence, negative to positive, and arousal low to high, and that goes a long way in terms of sort of explaining motivated behavior and what have you. On the other end of the spectrum, you have recent evidence that there are 27 different emotion categories that capture sort of a lot of the nuance of our emotional experience, and that in fact you know, in watching and looking at brain activations of people watching various emotional videos that generate these profiles of emotions, that most brain areas can actually be used to, the activity in most brain areas can be used to decode sort of the emotional profile of what people are experiencing. And so it just goes to show that there's so much in our personal experiences that also contributes to the emotions we're experiencing, you know, in the moment. And so while we might talk about musical features such as tempo or perhaps, you know, modality of the tonality as shaping aspects of arousal or valence or what have you, it's really this complex interaction with our history, and certainly in terms of the topics that your songs are covering, a lot of what we heard about earlier today, you know, that personal, you know, all this emotional and social information that is being maintained in our frontal lobe, which at the end of the day is, you know, responsible for motivating action and lies central to you know, everything from depression through all these various other psychiatric issues. It's just really complex, and the answer lies somewhere in, I think, looking at these various interactions.
Yeah, I was going to say, if it was a simple answer, many music psychologists would no longer be employed, right? I mean, it's going to be a problem that's going to keep plaguing us, I guess, or intriguing us is a better word. But I often think when that question comes up, how indeed I think music is so complex, right? And so beautiful to be able to create all of these or elicit all of these different emotions. But we as humans are equally complex. And if I think for my own, like a piece that really, really gets to me is Goraki's Third Symphony. And I remember being exposed to that early in my music therapy training program in a class, and I was crying as I would listen to it. So it already deeply touched me. But once I became a mother, that piece almost became impossible for me to listen to. Just the incredible sadness that I could imagine what it must be to lose a child. And it just had a completely different emotional output, if you wish, yet the same piece of music, same person listening to it. Yeah.
I mean, sure, yeah. I mean, part of what I hear you also talking about, which I think about a lot about, is that memory is so embedded in music, which is really interesting. I think it's also embedded a lot in scent as well. I don't know if that's a random thing, but I just feel like we don't talk about that as well. Just an aside. Yeah, smell, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, music is so tied to memory in really like extremely potent ways, which I think can almost in certain ways it goes to the second thing I was going to say, which is it goes past language or things that even sometimes you could even consciously name or consciously remember, you know, and I think those elements are so powerful because so much of our society is always defined by language. Like it's always defined by how you can talk about it with others or even dialogue with yourself, because it's the way that we learn to dialogue with ourselves is through how we name something. And so at least from my personal experience, one of the hardest things to do is to get yourself around something that you have no language for. And one of the ways to do that, obviously, is to receive more language for it, which is like really helpful. But there's also certain things that you just can't, like you don't have the language for. And I think that music is one of those tools in that place where you're just like, this is it, you know? Oh, this is what I was feeling. I don't exactly know what to call it, but this is that thing. And I also think that it feels to me like music is one of the only places in our society where it is immediately okay for people to be vulnerable. That's a big thing for me. As somebody who is a very sensitive person, I'm like, you know, I wanted our society not to be that way. It should be that we can be vulnerable everywhere. But that's not a reality of our society right now. And so I think because music is such an intimate, personal experience, it allows people to, and also because musicians are one of the only people in our society that are allowed to be vulnerable as a job, it allows everyone else, all the listeners, to be vulnerable as well.
Kevin, any thoughts? Looks like
Yeah.
you are. Great.
No, these are also such insightful comments. I totally agree. I think, you know, as Samora was talking about, like the evocative power, I do think, I'm remembering like the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, he had a nice piece, like wrote several years ago, on like what's missing in kind of the American mental health care system. He singled out like the 3 Ps, right? Like the people, places, and purpose, right? How like we have good treatments, but we still need more modalities to help people connect with people they love, to help create healing places, right? Sanctuaries, and to help them find purpose. And you know, in integrated medicine, we have so many tools at our disposal. We have acupuncture, massage, you know, creative arts, herb supplements, but I can't think of any other modality that can really touch on those 3 Ps as good as music. I haven't seen it, right? Like, so I think there's a lot there, how music can help people connect with others, can invoke kind of those memories that help them think of places that have special meaning, and to help people find purpose. So, yeah.
So in the healing process, how do you think music has the power to help with that? And again, this is going to be hard to talk about because we don't have the language for it. We don't have a lot of great conceptual models for this, and the mechanisms aren't really very well understood. But if you had to kind of push yourself and speculate, what is it about music and the process of either engaging in music, whether that's listening or making music, has a healing potential, especially in the context of mental health or pain or whatever kind of perspective you're coming from?
I think I'm going to connect to what you just said about music is maybe the only place where people can allow themselves to be vulnerable. And I think that is where a big potential lays for work in mental health and in healing, in that music is able to access emotions. Very often, maybe a bit unpredictably, like people are caught by surprise, right? That suddenly these emotions are coming up. Yet, so music can be dangerous in that way, right? It can be very potent and it can surprise you and evoke all of these emotions. But at the same time, now I'm thinking in terms of work in music therapy, a music therapist then is able to structure the music in such a way to provide a container for those emotions to allow to come out, and even more so to help the person deepen the experience of those emotions, so that it's not emotions come out, "Ooh, I'm sorry, take my tissue," and try to wipe them away. No, they're allowed to come out, and will help you contain them, will help to help you explore them. And the beautiful thing about what we're able to do in music therapy is that in verbal therapy, it's kind of you talk, I talk, you talk, I talk. But in music therapy, you talk, I play, and I accompany, and I can help, deepen the experience, hold you there, help you to come out of it, all while you are maybe talking or singing or exploring. So it's this beautiful process where a person can be allowed to grieve audibly, while I can audibly support them. And I think that's a really, really unique aspect of music therapy.
And you're talking about music can evoke kind of everyday emotions like sadness or nostalgia. But there's also an aspect of music that can evoke kind of more music-specific emotions, like the groove. And I know, Peter, you've done some work on research on trying to understand the groove in the context of music. What is this about, these everyday emotions versus some that might be more special to music?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure necessarily. Well, I think there are various aspects of groove. It's a complex construct, and the dimension of it that's been most strongly emphasized has perhaps been this pleasurable urge to move, right? So it's this invitation to interact with the music and the movement component. But the complement to that is that sense of unity, whether it's with the music or then with people who you're engaging with within that musical situation. And I think that social component is the very powerful emotional one. Often just the fact that you're now creating something that's pleasing, often that exceeds your expectations in terms of your ability to synchronize or interact with another individual. And so I think those forms of successful social action or interaction within that musical context are an important emotional aspect of the groove and potentially have some of the greatest therapeutic value.
Can I give a clinical example of the groove?
Please, yeah.
You're just making me think about interacting with another person. A couple of years ago, I started a chronic pain management study, and it was a vocal music therapy group. So participants were explained that we would use our voice a lot. They would sing, they would do vocal improvisations, and one woman was sitting with me during a consent meeting and said, "Well, I don't know about that." And I said, "Well, you don't have to participate in this study." And she says, "No, my doctor wants me to, and if he says I should, I will." And she came to the first session, and you can see on the video, they're going around and introducing themselves, and she says to the group, "Well, my name is, and let me tell you all, you're not going to hear me singing, and you're not going to see me do anything." And the next part of the session, the music starts, and you can already see the foot tapping. And not that session, but the next session, she was just grooving along with the group improvisations and became a completely different person in the sessions. And you could see her grooving together, improving with other people in the group. But yeah, so that's what music does, right?
Yeah.
I wondered if the panel could put on a slightly different hat now, and if you had to put some money down, some grant funding on where you think studies of music, emotion, and mental health should go in the future, what do you think we should be studying? Come on, Kevin.
Oh, my mentor always tells me I need to focus. I always have a hard time. There's just so many interesting questions, in the field. More interesting. I like right now. I feel like there's a lot. Like the more we learn about health, I realize there's a lot of health outcomes depend not on what I do in that 30-minute visit, right? But on what patients do outside of the, and just in their daily lives, right? How can we help them eat better, sleep better, manage stress better, and be more active? And now that music, hopefully with technology like Spotify, YouTube, it's getting more accessible. How can we harness that, right? Help patients harness that to implement these healthy lifestyle changes, right? Like the groove, right? If that can help someone get more active, if when people feel an urge to, not eat healthy, can they use music as a resource? So I've just been thinking about that more. There's so many other interesting ideas though.
Kevin and I just started collaborating on research, so we have a lot of fun.
Quickly say what that study's about. It's really exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's a large comparative effectiveness trial funded by PCORI, comparing virtual music therapy with virtual cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety management in cancer survivors. And so it's a study that is led by MSK, and it's very exciting. And it's talking about the situational factors that we were referring to earlier this morning. It's not only looking at, it's a non-inferiority trial, so it's looking at, is music therapy at least as effective as cognitive behavioral therapy? But then they're gathering a lot of data to be able to do subgroup analyses to see for whom is what most effective. So can we try to identify for whom cognitive behavioral therapy might be more effective than music therapy, for example? So, right? Did you want to add?
Yeah. No, we're really excited about it. I think we're already we recruited like the first 40, but already learning a lot. And the unique thing about these two interventions, right? They're all skills based, right? So ideally, we have that 7-session treatment session, but it's ultimately about all the skills they learn. How do they continue to implement that in their daily life, right? These are all survivors. They're going to be, and this is for the long term, right? So that's why I thought of that initially, right? They're learning new ways to access music. How would they take what they learned those 7 sessions, continue to draw upon it after that 7-session treatment period to manage their anxiety and stress? So yeah, we'll see. There's still a long way to go.
Exciting. We'll look for the results.
I definitely couldn't say where to put money for research. That
Right.
I'm not sure. What I will say is I do have a lot of opinions and thoughts about where money should go for application. And what I mean by that is that when we're talking about mental health, emotional health, any type of health, we can't pretend that we don't live in a society where certain people receive care and others don't, based on money, based on race, based on gender, whatever. And of course, the work that I'm doing puts that in stark relief. All the people that are working on, that are part of the Healing Project, are folks that do not receive mental, physical, emotional care of any kind from the system or the state. Not only that, they're traumatized every day, particularly if you're in prison, of course, like you are being re-traumatized every day. So I would say that my hope is that moving forward, more of this work will be geared towards providing care towards those populations, particularly, just to give an example, in the case of returning citizens, by which I mean people who have been released from prison. That's the term that I use because there's many terms that are very problematic that we use, is that for returning citizens, even in the best case scenario where they receive a job or they receive training or whatever, not to mention all the barriers that they have to housing, background checks, all this crazy stuff that they have to deal with the rest of their life. They can't vote. But on top of that, everyone is like, okay, go live your life now. Like, you've been rehabilitated, go figure it out. And there's no mental health care that they can receive most of the time. And so you talk about place, like for me, that was a big part of the Healing Project, was how can we create a physical place where people can go and have at least be and just feel like it's a healing place. That's the baseline. They're not receiving care there. There's just a place where they can be at, So my hope is just that there will be more care placed in that way. And the way I bring music into that is that music is one of the few places where there's no barrier to people engaging in that. Anywhere where they are, music is there, And that's another thing that's so powerful about it is it's not regulated by capitalism. I mean, it is. The music industry is very regulated by capitalism, let me tell you. But access to receiving, performing, creating, there's no way you can put a wall around that, So I think there's a lot of opportunities when it comes to using that. And my hope is that more funding will go in those directions.
Yeah, using music in the community to promote health equity is one definitely great goal. Where would you put your money, Peter?
Well, this is maybe a little far out there. So well, I think it's important wherever one puts one's money, as was talked about earlier, it's important to focus on mechanisms and understand particular mechanisms and understand, what deficits in which psychological processes or abilities underlie any given issue that one is trying to somehow support through some sort of music intervention. And one that I end up thinking a lot about is this, how does music support, how does music guide our spontaneous thought processes? How does music structure our thought processes? And, so often I find myself at some performance and I'm thinking I should be paying attention to what the clarinets are doing and the basses and so on. But so often, I just find myself that the music is helping to guide my thought process, and that's what I was alluding to in my reaction to your pieces. And the reason I think that's important is that so many of these things we talk about, depression, PTSD, OCD, a lot of these disorders lie in challenges of sort of structuring sequences of thought that allow us to consider our broad goals and then actually implement increasingly specific action plans that move us towards our goals. And so there's this hierarchical organization to the frontal lobe in terms of organizing these types of sequences. And so sequences modulate through time, and they have particular dynamics to them and things like that. And at the end of the day, music is this great non-linguistic journey that is sort of, I think of as providing a substrate for these types of dynamic processes that help us think through things, right? And sometimes it'll bring in elements of memories and things like that, but at the end of the day, I'd be very interested in seeing whether or not there is this sort of link between, the musical journey, as it were, and then the inner mental journey that allows one to help coalesce sequences of ideas that end up helping a person become more functional in their everyday environments.
Wow, yeah. Really well said in terms of thinking about mechanisms, but in an extremely creative way, too. Not bound to current models.
Yes.
How about we open it up to the audience for some questions? Time check, Indra? How? Maybe we have about 10-15 minutes. Perfect. Okay, any questions or comments, reactions from the folks? I'll see first. Anybody? Okay, I don't. Yes, you in the middle. Yes, please.
Looking at sort of sequencing of where there's some adherence issues with, say, CBT, some stigma that it's embedded within mental health or something, and it's skill-based. There's some challenging, but whether music therapy might make a person or participant more open to those sorts of more cognitive treatments and improve adherence and engagement in those treatments.
I'm not aware of studies that have shown that, but I will tell you, I just finished a study that was funded by the NIH with people with advanced cancer, a chronic pain management study, and it was comparing music therapy with verbal support. And in both treatment arms, this was a mixed method study, so we did interviews with all the participants afterwards, and in both treatment arms, what was very interesting is that a lot of the patients shared that they would have never gone to therapy, that their doctor had already told them, maybe you need to get some support, go to therapy, because therapy is taboo in their community. We work with a lot of Black residents in Philadelphia, and that they now see, whether it was in the music therapy or actually the support arm, that it's actually not that bad at all. It's actually very helpful, and now they've started talking to family members that may be the issue. So I'm not sure if it's, maybe the music therapy. I would say music therapy often allows, certainly with young people, opens up a door. It's like, oh, it's not the psychologist coming in, or it's not, it's only the music therapist. And so it gives them access to therapeutic processes, and through that, maybe they become more ready to engage in other types of therapy. But in our study, it was more about, actually for us, it was getting them in the door and having them sit with somebody who unconditionally listens to them and then engages with them. And that alone seemed to be enough to convince them that this could be helpful to them in the long term. So I'm not sure if it's, yeah.
Can I add something random to that, but really quick? Is that I definitely agree with you that, you know, in a lot of different contexts, for many different reasons, there are people that are obviously resistant or feel shame around, or like, you know, different things that keep them from being like, okay, I want to go to therapy. And particularly, I think obviously also like in a certain period of your life, certain, you know, teenage to 30 or whatever, it's like that is the primary space where there's a lot of resistance for a lot of reasons. And often, number one, like music, in that context, music is often really the only like therapy they have. Now, it's not a substitute for actual therapy, but it is sometimes the only place where there's that outlet, and that where you're hearing somebody make recognition of the things that you go through, so you don't feel like alone in it. And I also think that one of the things I'm excited about music right now is that there's a lot more conversation about going to therapy in music. Like there's a lot more musicians that are actually talking in their music, like Kendrick Lamar's new record and stuff like that, where he's like very actively, I'm going to therapy and I'm working out, all this stuff. And I think that does make a difference, particularly for young people who care a lot about those, you know, artists, that they're like, okay, if they're this person that I idolize and they're talking about this, then it will be a lot easier for me to go.
I worked in a children's hospital once with teenagers with newly spinal cord injuries. And when you would walk into their room, or the clinical psychologist at the team meetings would often say, well, no, they don't, you know, he or she doesn't, or they don't want to talk to us. They didn't want me to come in. And when we would go in as music therapists, we were 2 music therapists there, we had a songwriting program going. And we would just bring out a Mac, and we would introduce ourselves and say, hey, we have a songwriting program in the hospital. Would you be interested? They would say, I don't know. And then you immediately open up the Mac, you show them GarageBand, and there you got them, and they're in it. And by the end of the hour, you have a song written, and they, you know, are opening up. And so, in that way, music can certainly provide an access that might be harder to accomplish if you don't have that GarageBand tool in your pocket.
There were some questions over here.
I have a question about what do you think the role of control is in terms of when you have like the emotions in music? So in a song has a beginning and an end. There's control over whether you can turn it off or turn it on. And so in a way, it's a kind of safe context to experience an emotion. And so one of the things I think that leads to a lot of mental health issues is a sense of not being in control, the loss of agency. And I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about how important that element is. Is it important? And, you know, is that like maybe a mechanistic way in which allows for it to, I'm going to stop by.
In the study that I just described, we're just done with our data analysis, and it was a mechanistic study funded by NINR and Nursing Institute. And the one mechanism that came out really strongly was pain-related self-efficacy. And so self-efficacy has to do with, a sense of control. Am I able to lead my life fully, or am I able to do these things in spite of pain? Do I feel like I'm going to have control to keep the pain from getting worse? And so that was a very strong mediator, so that people who received the music therapy had much greater pain-related self-efficacy by week 4, and that then led to greater pain reduction and much less pain interference. And I think how we achieved that in music therapy was actually teaching patients how to use music to help with stress management at home, mood enhancement, so some of the mediators that we were targeting, but also in the music therapy sessions through creative engagement and getting them, actively involved in active music making, identifying their emotions, exploring them, working through them within a safety of the structure of the music, I think made them move from feeling victimized by the pain and helpless in face of advanced cancer to maybe more a sense of empowerment. And in the qualitative data, that's exactly what we're seeing, that people felt empowered again. So it's not quite control, but kind of that, yeah.
Time for probably one more question. Yes.
And then you brought him up anyway. So I listened to your album Reach like maybe a week ago, and then Hendrix like 2 weeks before, I mean 2 weeks before ago. And I feel like they're so parallel and so in sync with each other. And I'm just, from your perspective, can you imagine being like a teenager and hearing those two albums? Like what would be the effect on you? I'm trying to think about like if we're imagining the power, talking about masculinity and prison and trauma and therapy. What do you hope is sort of the impact on younger folks today? And get back to the original question, what would be the effect on you as a young person to hear that today coming from someone like Kendrick or someone like yourself?
Well, you're being very kind to me. I appreciate that. Putting me in that sentence, but so thanks. But I will tell you that the subject matter is eerily similar. I will say that for sure, and I have received that feedback often, which I think is not a mistake. Not only in the sense that I think even beyond those records, I can think of other records that this time period. Well, first of all, so many people are very consumed by grieving, the grieving process. Like has touched all of us, and there is this reality that number one, we are consumed with the grieving process in a society that does not give us any tools for how to grieve. Wants us to ignore it completely and be like, we're not going to pretend that 1 million people didn't die from this thing, like in our country, and we're just like still, just dealing with it, right? So that's the reality that, particularly with young people who have even less language for it, and are just like, oh, well, I guess we're just supposed to keep living. Like, I think there are a lot of artists that are consumed with, trying to give language to that, and also, also in the context where we're also isolated, and so there's this idea of we're just holding these things, and this kind of goes to that control thing that I think one of the elements I associate with control in a bad way is sublimation, right? And I think a lot of times we're taught to sublimate and just push down our feelings when they're not convenient for, number one, for other people or for ourselves, or when we just like don't know how to deal with them. It's just like push it down. In particular, I'll say, of course, there's an element, the patriarchal element to that too, where particularly as men, we're taught like, do not, talk about this. So I think that those albums, I would cite another album that influenced me a lot, which is this album called When Smoke Rises by the artist Mustafa, the poet, which is just like an amazing record. Another one that I think would be incredible to really use around, the complexity of the grieving process. But my hope is just that if I were a young person or thinking about a young person listening to those records, one thing I would want them to hopefully understand is that it's okay for you to feel one way one day and totally different the next day, and for you to really not have a handle on life being very contradictory, and I think that's another thing that I think music can do really well is that it's not binary. The best music to me is not binary. It's everything at once. And that's, to me, at least my experience is that's very much the feeling of being alive. Like, it's just like, I don't know. Like, I don't know how to put a hand on this, So I think hopefully there's a resonance in people that, okay, it's okay for me to be many things at once and for me not to really have a handle on this sometimes. And hopefully not to just live inside that and have no tools for it. But then the second part is that hopefully the music will give you tools for it, And some of those tools I cannot provide that y'all could provide or a therapist could provide or different, I'm sure, processes can provide. But I think the music can provide some language, it can provide some information, it can provide an outlet for those emotions, and it can provide tools in the form of experience of an artist saying, I'm experiencing this too, and this is how I'm trying to move through it. And this worked, and this really didn't work. And I made this mistake, and I learned this from that mistake. And now I'm trying to do it like this. And I'm not really there yet, but maybe that's not the point, you know? And I think that hopefully people listening will be able to, you know, take that and run with it.
Thank you, Samora. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Yoke. That was terrific.